Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final week of Debates and Culture, which is this month's review on issues that are important in debating. And in this final weeks, we're going to look at the impact of movies in cultures and perceptions, right? So we've discussed broadly why culture is important, what is culture, how culture is all around us, how states, people, individuals, groups use culture, and how, given that there is culture, how that impacts other things, like how that impacts integration, how that impacts our political identity, how that impacts even employment and work, how people use culture as a tool to market ideas and to gain more ownership of ideas and values, right? So it's a super powerful thing. This week we're going to look at how movies, the arts, generally, but focusing on movies, shapes our perceptions of culture. And also how movies themselves is a form of culture, right? So just to clarify, I'm not going to go into the culture of movies or the different kinds of genres of movies, but we want to look at how the things that you watch impact you, right? So there's a slight overlap between this and, say, debates about arts or debates about the media, and which we have covered before. And if you've done that, then we're good for you. And you'll see some arguments overlap, like influence and things like that. But I also want you to think about how the things you watch shape your culture, your views, right? How does culture evolve? And a large part of how it evolves is based on your exposure to these new ideas. And movies are a very powerful form of that exposure, along with books and all those other things. But we want to focus specifically on movies. So that's what the debate is going to be about today: the cultural power of movies. So let's get to it. Specifically, looking at eventually we'll look at superheroes specifically because, well, it's fun to discuss superheroes, but they're also a kind of microcosm of all the problems that we see with the portrayal of characters in movies, right? So look at this group. This is uniformly Anglo-Saxon. Two women here and here, but also look at how the women are portrayed compared to how the men are portrayed and how the women are standing, right? But among all of this, there's also really diversity in terms of race. Lots of, there's a green guy here and like a small guy, but no minorities. And yeah, granted, maybe you say like, look, this looks pretty old. But even if you had a string of superheroes today, can you think of the number of minority superheroes, right? It's hard to actually think of them. And if you may actually be more lucky, I'm not sure if it's lucky, but if you try to think of minority villains, you may actually get a little bit more luck. And that's odd, right? So why are those choices made? And do those choices of who these superheroes are or who any kind of character is in a movie impact how people feel when they watch them, right? And the argument that we're going to make today is that there is an impact. To what extent there is an impact, I suppose we can have that debate. Okay, so the big question is, what to extent do movies impact your identity? And given the scale of that impact, then we can talk about the responsibility, right? So if there is high impact on your identity, then there should also be high responsibility. If there's no impact, no responsibility. So you don't have to argue in this debate there's absolutely no impact, but you can talk about the extent of that impact. But importantly, we also want to discuss the type of that impact, right? So how does it impact your identity? And this is a very, very interesting part. So you'll have debates about or issues around how people, develop role models, how people understand values and ideas based on their identity, how movies' portrayal of power relationships, right? So if a movie portrays men as always being masculine and always being strong and women as always being weak, then watching those things teaches you something, right? It's like reading books that teach you something or parents telling you things that teach you something. But there's also a great ability for us to identify with these things because these movies are glorified. The people in the movies are portrayed as heroes. They are portrayed as being wonderful people. Everyone queues up to watch them. We celebrate these guys, right? we give them awards, we do all kinds of fantastic, wonderful, wonderful things. And so it's hard, it has a positive correlation with your consciousness, and then shapes your value. So when you watch all of these things, whether you know it or not, it is creating an impression on you. And because, and it's powerful, right? If you watch a movie can make you laugh, it can make you cry, it can make you think, it can make you upset, it can make you frustrated. It does all of these things. So at a subconscious level, it may be doing other things to you as well. Okay? At least that's one way we'll argue the impact of identity on movies. And the other side we'll talk about, yeah, it does, maybe, but to what extent does it do? And they will talk about conflicting impacts. They'll say there'll be other narratives that will argue against this narrative. So this narrative isn't the overwhelming, contributor to shaping your identity, because you have parents, you have society, you have all of those things, right? So these movies don't act in isolation compared to other things, right? So because you'll also have books, and when we talk about movies, don't, separate movies and TV. I don't think you need to. Although if it's that specific of a debate, then yeah, there are distinctions between movies and series and all these other kinds of programs. But basically, I think they're talking about visual art stuff on TV. What are the other things that impact your identity? Books, campaigns, all of these things fall within media, perhaps, right? Campaigns, maybe, depending on who's running those campaigns. What else? Yeah, your parents. So this is not like movies about parents, okay? This is things that contrast against movies. So maybe I should do it like that. An arrow against. What else? Your religion, your culture. Now, when I say culture here, you go like, but wait a minute, what do you mean by culture? Because culture is represented through all of these other things as well. And that's where it also gets interesting. So my culture defines my choices, but my choices also shape my culture. Does that make sense? So because I am culturally, more exposed to, say, language, maybe I'm Spanish speaking, I grew up in an area with Spanish speaking exposure and Spanish culture. So I like watching Spanish movies. I like watching, I like dancing the flamenco. I like doing all this other stuff. So because that's defined by my culture is driving my choices. But the things that I choose also, so let's say I watch a Spanish movie, but a Spanish series, but then in that movie it represents other cultures too, right? And those other cultures also impact me. And if I am exposed to something else, like to more English, I'm exposed to, Japanese food and sushi culture, and then I start making those choices, and that impacts my culture, right? So you're in a constant kind of state of flux, and your culture is moving. Your culture drives your choices, but your choices also ends up impacting your culture. Okay? So that's this complex relationship between movies, the things that you watch and enjoy, and your how it shapes your thinking and your identity, and then how that shapes your choices and then shapes your identity, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. Right? So the things that have a lot of power in shaping your identity, that compete among the different choices, right? So say you didn't have culturally appropriate choices. If I was in a different culture or one type of movie, and this is what people say about Hollywood a lot, that they dominate, the screens. They're better promoted. They drown out every other local production or other countries, production from other countries, and therefore other cultures. Your cultural view isn't reinforced, right? Your cultural view is drowned out by these other cultural views, and therefore your cultural view will start to suffer. Of course, your cultural view will be reinforced at home and reinforced through other aspects. But from the movie's aspect, the cultural view will start to lose out. And then if you compare how important or which one of these views has more power, then you can show maybe how one suffers, right? How your culture may disappear. Okay. So, before I get carried away talking about culture, let's get down to our topic for today and focus on that example, right? So, does the movie industry have a responsibility to present ethnically diverse superheroes? Interesting debate on a couple of levels. Delicious. It's interesting because we're going to talk about about movies, right? And culture. I mean, we're going to talk about superheroes. And also interesting because you need to ask yourself what this debate is doing, what this debate is about, right? This debate is not about a policy, because you're not asking them to do something or not do something. Of course, it may lead to them doing more of one or the other, but it's not, on the surface of it, a movie about policy. So it's not about a censorship debate. It's not a debate about legalizing something, right? It's not asking it to impose a quota. So it shifts the debate a little bit, right? It's a debate about whether or not there is a relationship, whether they should be doing this or not doing this. Of course, if you prove that they should, then you hope that they will. How they do it is different, right? But you first argue that they should. So it's a little bit narrower that way. Don't get caught up with proposing policies, right? So you don't need any sort of policy in this debate. Okay? So the context here you develop is the power movies have in influencing people, right? And the choice of superheroes here is interesting. So because, who follows superheroes, who gets obsessed by them, who loves watching superheroes? Well, everybody, to be honest, and anybody of any age. But you can argue specifically people who are young. And the young part is really important because, well, everybody likes talking about the youth. The youth are this sacred, special, pure, innocent group that can never be destroyed and damaged. But also because, once your cultural views and stuff are set when you're young, it becomes very, very difficult to change later on in life. Okay, so the context is about, we live in a world where movies plays a strong role and they are more powerful than most other sources of outside influence of your culture. And by outside influence, I mean things outside the home, right? So not innate from you and not from your family. I think you can also talk about Hollywood if you want. And this is another thing that the superheroes bring, because let's face it, you can have different kinds of movies in different kinds of countries, places, contexts, etc. But the superheroes thing is pretty much an American concept. You can think of some Japanese anime heroes and stuff maybe, but if in the modern kind of movie era, superheroes equals American heroes, right? And therefore American narratives. And focusing on this can show how this one type of cultural view can end up drowning out other cultural views, right? The only other thing is that this notion of ethnically diverse. So this happens in a world where you have many different ethnicities. I think that goes without saying. Arguments. You should have thought of a couple that we can run now. You may have thought of these. Let's look at them. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, right? The influence of people. So this is talking about the power of movies. Secondly, and this could be interesting, why specifically superheroes, right? Every word in the motion is important, and going after specific words will help you develop analysis. Thirdly, this notion of responsibility, why films also have a responsibility, and you can compare this responsibility with other forms of responsibility, and to what extent they have a responsibility, and show how they've taken that responsibility in the past, etc., etc., right? So let's go through them one by one. So influence on youth, influence on equality. I discussed this a little bit already, the power of movies. Power of movies, right? So this how it shapes, by creating role models, how it expresses your values, right? How it highlights different kinds of, power relationships. When you watch a movie, you empathize with the characters on that movie. You think about how you are that character. Now, when you don't see characters that you can empathize with fully, or when characters that you more naturally empathize with are portrayed in a negative role in that movie, that gets you to question things about life, right? So if women watch movies, and there are very few movies that portray women as CEOs of companies. It's almost always men. The portrayal is of, secretaries. So the most women who watch it, if a young girl says I want to be like that guy, then what she's saying is she wants to be a different role than what has been laid out for her. Because she has to say, I want to be like that man, and I'm not a man. Like, you have to change. Versus a boy who says I want to be a CEO, He's not saying, I want to change and become something else, right? Of course, the similar thing would apply to boys. If boy says, like, I want to be a secretary, I want to be a beauty model or something, then they'll say, like, no, fashion designer, those roles are for women only, these roles are for men. So there are these things, these blocks, and movies help perpetuate those blocks, right? And when it comes to things like, so this is you arguing this thing on general, when it comes to things like superheroes, they portray this world, they're fighting for justice. These are people that are desirable, that everybody wants to be. And now some groups are left out of that conversation. That's really, really bad. That's really, really sad. It shapes your identities and so on and so forth. Okay? So, in this first argument, you are talking about generally the impact of movies on shaping people's ideas, right? How people empathize with the characters in the movie, and then about on youth and how young people end up shaping their ideas and so on and so forth. Okay, try not to go into specifically why superheroes, although you can start using some of those examples. Number 2, we talk about superheroes. So again, there may be some similarity, role models, empowering, right? But talk about what makes superheroes unique. What does make superheroes unique? The fact that they are clear good versus evil. Okay, so there's not a lot of room for complexity there. And it tells people who's good, right? If you're not there, then you're not good. Superheroes are also model for things like cooperation, teamwork, right? They all end up working together, and when they don't work together with when their teams are not ethnically diverse, it seems to send the message that one person is left out. There's also the youth impact. If you talked about youth already, you don't need to talk about youth, but there's a specific youth focus with superheroes. And many people model themselves over superheroes. You can see many other, movies where you don't see kids like talking about how they want to be, like characters from classic literature. Like, I want to be Dickens, Oliver Twist, or I want to be Gatsby, or whatever it is. But you'll see them saying, I want to be like X superhero, or this other X superhero. And then one kid tell the other kid about, hey, the black kid's not in that superhero, like the brown kid's not. You can't be, I can be. That creates problems, okay? So we think it's important to have an equal distribution and to get the world of the superheroes model as closely as possible over real society, and perhaps be even more equitable than real society. After all, these guys are supposed to be a utopian world, right? Where you're so good and so special and so nice, and yet there is no racial equality, then this world isn't really utopian. The world is a bit broken, okay? Finally, talk about ethical films and the responsibility of the movie industry. And this is where you get into the art versus, life kind of debate, or art versus, movie. So they're just making art. It's not really life, or it is life. It's based on life. It has an impact on life. Therefore, it's not just art, right? So you show that how movies have become more and more ethical, and movies care, right? Movies sometimes have a warning at the end of them. Well, not a warning, but like a disclaimer. It says like, this movie has been really, really ethical. Can you think of an example? Yeah? Maybe that's a good one. If you said that, then that's good. And that is that they, no animals were harmed in the making of this movie. Why do they do that? Because they don't want you to feel bad for the animals there, and because there is a movement for ethical treatment of animals, right? So old movies don't have that. They just do whatever they want with animals, and newer ones do. Newer movies will also be really careful about the social fallout of the movie. Think about who they cast in the movie, where they shoot the movie, their sources of funding, so on, right? Many of these different things. So movies also have some kind of ethical responsibility. It's not just you can do whatever you want. And if you can establish this, then you can say, well, why not then this thing which they do? Why don't they care about this? Okay? So that's the pro side of the motion. Show that movies are really, really powerful, number one. Show that superhero movies are especially important for these stakeholders, and because of the type of movies that they are. And finally, talk about how there is a trend of ethical movies and ethical representation, and why this needs to be extended. What about opposition? So in opposition, I think it's hard for you to say there's no relationship whatsoever between movies and how people view themselves, but say it's a very small relationship, right? Say that it is a negligible relationship. Okay, so that's one. Yes, relationship in your position, but tiny relationship. I'm going to write it really small. Okay, and very, 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 very small. And you talk about how other factors are more important. Okay, so you want to create some kind of balance. And the role of the movie is not to set social norms and social standards. Because honestly, we don't want a world where movie stars get to tell us how we behave and how we should act, right? So that could be a position on op. That there is some responsibility, but it's a small responsibility and other people need to take a bigger obligation to create some kind of change, right? You can also run a kind of slippery slope argument, but let's get into that argument. So, 3 things. Number 1, responsibility of movie is just to entertain. Number 2, placing obligation artificially increases the impact of those movies and could be harmful. And number 3, the goal is to create a post-ethnic world. And this is your kind of philosophical argument that you're going to run. So number 1, responsibility of movie is just to entertain. And here is where you establish your art for the sake of art. For sake of art argument, right? Sake of art. There you go, finally. Art for the sake of art argument. That it is about entertainment. It is about expression. It is about creating some kind of, stimulus for our normal everyday lives. And people need to view it that way, right? People need to see it as something that is fun and entertaining. And if you don't like it, then don't watch it. And you have the right to criticize it. And they have the right to kind of react to that criticism. But what they're not supposed to do is always keep making political commentary. Okay? And you can say that it's up to people to interpret it as they like. And if you want, you can interpret it in however way you like. And you can modify and, localize it and make it fit your own ethnic norms and so on and so forth. But what they're doing is just producing art on that level. Okay, and what the rest of the world needs to do is just accept it in that way. So the responsibility of movies are just to entertain. And then you can talk about all the crazy things that movies produce and whether or not that should be restricted and how we can lose that, etc., etc., etc. Okay, good. Secondly, having established that it is just about art, say that placing an obligation will artificially increase the impact that movies have on our lives. So you're saying it makes them more important than they actually are. And when you make them more important than they are, and you're saying that they're harmful, they could create more harm. So what we should be doing is actually telling people that chillax, man, the movie is just a movie. Okay? And don't get frustrated, don't get like, too angry and nervous and whatever about it. And yeah, don't freak out, right? It's just a movie. If you do the opposite thing and tell people that it's a lot more than a movie, then it makes it harder for others who are telling people to ignore the movies because they can't ignore them. They're really important. And you're also then encouraging people to take their values from these movies. And where else you actually don't want them to do that, right? You also say it can be harmful because then now it reduces the focus that we place on other things and reduce the focus on the role of government, on the role of parents, right? On social organizations, on things that happen in the community, things that happen in real life. And you say these things are way, way, way more important. And this is what actually improves social integration or conflict in societies, right? So if there is a nicely, happily, well-integrated society, then the movie is not going to end up dividing them. Then whatever color the kid is, they can play Superman and the other kid will play, Batman and whatever it is. And they're not going to draw lines based on their ethnicity. Because what they're doing is not shaping shaping their lives around the movies. They're shaping the movies around their lives. If their lives are already split up, then they're going to split up the movie. If their lives are not split up, then, they won't split up the movie as well because they don't see race, right? They just see each other. So you need to keep the focus on real life and real societies, go after the root of the problem and not worry about these movies. and focusing on the movies will actually create more harm. Okay? Last but not least, talk about how we want to create a post-ethnic world. And our long-term goal, right, is to completely remove ethnicity or to remove people identifying based on ethnicity, right? So, you're not, ignoring the fact that racism exists in society, distinct cultures and distinct ethnicities exist in society, but you want to move towards a society where we care about these things less and less, where we don't want to have quotas for different groups. Because you argue that creating quotas actually encourages separation, right? Because now you have to force people within those different groups and try to make sure each group exists, which highlights the fact that they are groups in the first place. So what about people who are in between groups? Where do they fit? They're forced to then choose one over the other. What can people select into a different group? What if I empathize with a different culture, a different ethnicity more than I do with this one? So what we need to do is move beyond these things, right? To say that the culture and ethnicity is way more important than movies, and that the specific representation of these things, that we need to create societies where the type of your ethnicity and stuff doesn't matter, doesn't count. Your color doesn't have a role, and that's what we need to move towards. And you holding this responsibility and nitpicking about this stuff just makes the world a far more complicated place. Okay, so it's a little bit of philosophical argument, maybe a little bit challenging to pull off, but I think has value. And at least in the sphere where you're discussing ethnicity and culture and you're discussing responsibility, it definitely has some space. Okay, so something for you to think about. We have some arguments here on pro, some arguments there on con. Something for you to think about when you watch a movie, right? And plenty of research that you probably have already done. And in debates like this, you should use many examples. When you talk about, international relations debates, and then you try to quote Rambo, or you try to quote a movie that you watch, and I hope you've watched Rambo, and that example doesn't give away my age, but that makes you seem, a little bit silly because I'm quoting something fictional. But this debate is all about movies, so you should quote all the movies that you've seen, right? Because it's completely relevant. No excuse for you to not have any examples in this debate. Last thing I'm going to do before I sign out is leave you with this. And hopefully in a post-ethnic, superhero world, maybe this image may be relevant or may not be relevant. But either way, I thought it was pretty cool. Have fun debating about movies and superheroes, guys. Onward and beyond.